There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
The monarchy did not tremble because of a scandal. It did not shake because of a political crisis. It shook because the man at its center finally uttered the one sentence nobody ever expected to hear from him. When King Charles quietly said, "I can no longer serve," those 6 words tore through the palace like a crack spreading across centuries of royal tradition. No shouting followed. No dramatic confrontation. Something far more dangerous happened. Silence. The kind of silence that appears when everyone in a room realizes history has already changed before anyone has had time to react. And behind that silence was a question nobody wanted to answer. Had the King of the United Kingdom just begun the process of surrendering the throne? The room froze because everyone understood the meaning hidden beneath those words. This was not a temporary pause. It was not a short-term absence. It was not a monarch asking for rest. The palace already knew what the public did not. Preparations had been moving quietly behind closed doors. Documents had been reviewed. Contingency plans had been examined. Conversations had been happening away from cameras. What appeared to be a single statement was actually the visible tip of something much larger. The possibility of abdication was no longer theoretical. It was approaching reality. Charles sat before the statement prepared for him, but something had shifted. The page no longer controlled the moment. The moment controlled him. Abdication meant giving up the throne before death, and everyone present understood the constitutional gravity of that possibility. If the sovereign stepped aside, Britain would not simply witness a change of leadership. The entire monarchy would enter a carefully managed transfer of power, carrying enormous emotional and political consequences. The palace confirmed preparations were imminent. That confirmation alone revealed that the machinery had already begun moving. Camilla watched Charles abandon the written text and immediately sensed something deeper. His face carried an exhaustion that no public appearance had ever fully revealed. She saw not just the king struggling under responsibility, but a husband confronting limits he never imagined admitting. The crown had become heavier than pride, heavier than duty, heavier than the lifelong promise he made to serve. And that realization terrified her because it suggested the battle was already being lost. Across the room, William lowered his eyes, not from shock, from recognition. He understood exactly what those words meant. The burden that had rested on Charles was beginning to move toward him. The silence in that room felt less like a pause and more like an invisible coronation beginning years earlier than anyone expected. The future king understood the transfer had started before anyone dared call it that. Then came a gesture so small it might have escaped public attention, but not those inside the room. Charles picked up a pen, held it, examined it, then quietly placed it beside the final page without signing. That movement struck harder than any speech, because everyone present knew about the abdication framework, a private plan, a confidential roadmap outlining procedures if the sovereign could no longer continue. Camilla saw the folder. William saw it too. Neither needed an explanation. The palace had prepared for this possibility long before this meeting began. The closed doors suddenly became more significant than any royal ceremony. Charles appeared older after speaking the sentence aloud. Truth had stripped away layers of royal performance. Camilla wanted to reach toward him, to comfort him, to stop whatever was happening. Yet she remained frozen because even one emotional gesture might expose the panic growing beneath her composure. William sat perfectly still, but his silence revealed something equally important. The future had arrived far sooner than he expected. Then an aide stepped forward and requested that William remain behind after the meeting. The atmosphere instantly changed. Camilla turned toward Charles, waiting for him to object, waiting for him to protect her place in whatever happened next. But he said nothing. That silence hurt more than any refusal could have. In that moment, she realized the next conversation might happen without her involvement. Every abdication begins with documents. But this one began with faces. Charles pale and exhausted. Camilla desperately holding together her composure. William carrying the terrible discipline of a man suddenly being measured for a destiny arriving too quickly. Catherine observing everything and understanding that history had entered the room before anyone officially acknowledged it. Charles knew something else had changed. The people around him were no longer seeing him only as husband, father, or monarch. They were watching a king caught between duty and decline, a man who had spent decades waiting for the throne, only to discover that service itself could become overwhelming. The title of sovereign meant carrying the authority of the crown. If he could no longer continue, Britain would need a new center of gravity. That was why the silence mattered. This was not a schedule adjustment. It was the possible relocation of the monarchy's heartbeat. Camilla felt the announcement like a door quietly closing behind her. She had survived scandals, criticism, public judgment, and years of scrutiny beside Charles. Yet this felt entirely different. If he stepped away from the throne, she would not merely lose influence. She would lose proximity to power itself. The queen consort watched him carefully, searching for reassurance. Instead, she found distance. Charles kept his eyes lowered. That small separation created a wound no public criticism ever could. William found himself standing at the center of a crisis he never requested. Succession had transformed overnight from a distant certainty into an immediate reality. Catherine sensed the fear he refused to display. After the meeting ended, she gently touched his arm. William did not pull away. That tiny gesture exposed a truth hidden beneath royal discipline. The future king could face an entire nation, but in that moment he needed a reminder that he was still a human being. Then another revelation emerged. Princess Anne had already been briefed separately. That fact changed everything. Charles had trusted his sister with information before others received it. Camilla noticed. William noticed too. Suddenly a hidden hierarchy became visible. Trust was being redistributed. Influence was shifting. Power was quietly reorganizing itself. A glance toward an empty chair deepened the mystery. The chair belonged to a constitutional advisor, a legal voice typically summoned only when royal duty and national law were preparing to collide. The advisor never appeared. Yet the empty chair carried enormous significance. Its absence spoke louder than its presence could have. Finally, Camilla asked whether the decision could be delayed. Anne did not hesitate. She did not soften the truth. She did not offer comfort. She simply looked directly at Camilla and answered with two devastating words: "Not anymore." And with those words, the palace was forced to confront the hidden event that had started all of this 3 nights earlier behind a closed library door. Because the public announcement was not the beginning, it was the consequence. The real turning point happened during what was supposed to be an ordinary constitutional briefing. Charles entered that room as king. He left it as a man confronting a future he could no longer ignore. 3 nights earlier, behind a closed library door, the monarchy encountered a truth it had spent years avoiding. What began as a routine constitutional briefing slowly transformed into the moment that would eventually force King Charles to say the unthinkable words aloud. The room was quiet. The files were organized. The officials spoke carefully, yet hidden inside one particular document was a future nobody wanted to discuss. It was called the Continuity Memorandum, an emergency framework explaining what would happen if a monarch could no longer fulfill royal duties. The moment Charles opened it, the crisis stopped being theoretical. The pages outlined scenarios with brutal clarity: prolonged instability, reduced capacity, emergency transfer mechanisms, public confidence risks, constitutional consequences. Every line forced Charles to confront a possibility he had spent years refusing to entertain. The monarchy depended on stability, yet the document argued something far more uncomfortable. If a monarch remained too long while struggling to perform duties, hesitation itself could damage the institution. The crown could suffer more from uncertainty than from transition. For the first time, Charles found himself facing a terrifying question. Was remaining on the throne actually becoming a greater threat than leaving it? William noticed the change immediately. He had seen his father tired before, exhausted before, frustrated before, but this was different. This was recognition. Charles was not reading a crisis plan anymore. He was reading a description of himself. The king closed the memorandum and asked everyone to leave except William. Once the door shut, royal protocol disappeared, and only father and son remained. The silence between them felt heavier than anything written inside the document. William expected instructions. Instead, he received honesty. Charles admitted that he had rehearsed the sentence privately countless times, but never dared speak it aloud. "I can no longer serve." The words landed with devastating force, not because they sounded weak, because they sounded true. William did not interrupt. He understood immediately that this was not surrender, it was confession, and a king's confession could shake a palace more deeply than any public scandal. As midnight approached, another revealing moment unfolded. Charles removed his signet ring and placed it on the desk. The ring represented family authority, identity, and continuity. He stared at it for several seconds. William watched every movement. Then Charles slowly put it back on. That hesitation revealed the real battle. He was not ready to release the crown, but he was no longer certain he should keep it. By dawn, Charles summoned Princess Anne. That decision revealed everything. When Charles needed truth rather than comfort, he turned to Anne. She arrived without ceremony and listened carefully as her brother explained the growing crisis. Unlike others, she did not attempt to soften reality. She understood duty better than almost anyone inside the royal family, and once she heard what happened inside the library, her conclusion formed quickly. Delay was becoming dangerous. The confrontation that followed changed the atmosphere of the palace. Anne and Camilla found themselves standing on opposite sides of the same question. Camilla argued for time. Anne argued for action. Camilla insisted Charles deserved dignity, privacy, and space before any formal transition began. She refused to see him reduced to procedures and schedules. To her, he was a husband before he was a constitutional figure. Anne saw a different danger. Then he spoke the sentence that settled the argument. "Let William hear it from me." Everything changed. The decision had moved beyond debate. The future king would now become the central witness. And from that moment forward, the palace machinery accelerated. William's schedule quietly transformed. Meetings once reserved for Charles appeared on his desk. Emergency briefings arrived. Constitutional consultations increased. Transition planning expanded. The public still saw an heir. The palace was beginning to see something else. A successor preparing for immediate responsibility. Even Catherine noticed the shift. Files arrived faster. Security discussions intensified. Private consultations multiplied. Every day brought another subtle sign that power was already moving in William's direction. Then came perhaps the most emotional discovery of all. Inside a transition folder, William found a handwritten note from Charles. Only one sentence. "Do not let my ending weaken your beginning." William read it repeatedly. Not as a king, as a son. And suddenly the entire crisis felt less political and more personal. This was no longer merely about a throne. It was about a father who had waited decades to reign, only to discover that duty sometimes demands sacrifice in its cruelest form. As dawn approached beyond Buckingham Palace, Britain remained unaware of just how much had already changed behind those walls. But inside the palace, everyone understood the same unsettling reality. The question was no longer whether the crown would eventually pass to William. The question was how much more would happen before the world learned that King Charles had already begun saying goodbye.